that.
Hello, and welcome very much. I am excited about that word chat, because David Crystal is somebody I've admired for many years. He's been called a national treasure. He's been called the most popular linguist in the world. He's known for his ability to bring linguistics to everybody, to make it accessible, and which is only appropriate that we all feel that the language is accessible to us, since it's our language. David has studied, written about the English language for decades. I lost count. I believe that I haven't bothered to count actually, but he's credited with about 120 books. We will ask him to list them if he can. There it is, David Crystal. Welcome to that word chat.
Thank you, Mark. Oh, that's impossible. I don't think anybody's got a memory like that. I couldn't do it. No.
Yeah. So let me start out with we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is why we started the show, because here's an opportunity that we can actually bring people into our homes without keeping them on the other side of the room. And they say that during the pandemic that we all ought to be creative and producing something, art or whatever. So are you finally sitting down and writing that book you've always wanted to do, that you put off?
Oh, every week I'm doing that though, Mark. The surprising thing is, and I think many authors recognize this immediately, authoring and editing, of course, is a very lonely profession at times, isn't it? You sit at home with your text and your computer or whatever, and you don't go out much sometimes. Actually, when the pandemic started, I didn't see much difference with the way I'd been living the previous few weeks. That's the way it is. Of course, I'm fortunate in having an excellent son staying with us at the moment who does all the shopping and things like that. So yes, I've been sitting here. Yeah, I've been sitting here, getting on with the next projects and generally keeping up with the latest ones and so on. And then doing an awful lot of this kind of thing, actually, far more than I'd normally do. Skype type and Zoom type talks to various parts of the world, which suddenly has made me almost busier than I would normally be pre-pandemic.
Yeah, I can see that. And you're right. I'm the same way. I work from home as a copy editor, and nothing really changed in terms of my clients sending me things, clients I'd never met before, sending me things and me working at home. So I
remember the very first time I went to a copy editor proofreader conference, with the British one, years and years and years ago now. And I didn't know what to expect. And I went into this room and there were a whole cluster of about 20 or so copy editors and proofreaders sitting around this cafe sort of area. But they weren't talking to each other because they didn't know how. That was the impression I got. They weren't used to it.
Yeah.
But it was a false impression. They were the chattiest crowd ever. But to begin with, you go out of your cave into this open world, and you have to use your voice. What? I mean, what's that got to do with editing and proofreading?
Well, let's talk about that, because that's a good segue into your next book. I assume it's your next book. Every time I turn around, there's another David Crystal book coming out. And your next book is on conversation.
Yeah.
Let's talk how English conversation works. And it's a good thing we're starting out with that since this is a conversation. So are we doing it correctly?
We most certainly are. Have you seen the book yet?
I don't think it's not out yet here. Maybe
No,
it's out yet there.
no, it isn't.
Okay.
It was due out on Shakespeare's birthday, April the 23rd. Haha,
Oh,
better the day, the better the deed. But it was delayed, you see, like so many books have been. Oxford University Press decided that distribution was awful at that point, so they've postponed it to July. But this is what it is. That's what it
all
looks
right.
like. Nice bright yellow cover.
Very nice.
And it's a book I've always wanted to write, but was a bit scared of writing in a way, because the amount of research that's been done for a long time was very limited. And I didn't quite know how to approach it. But then gradually, with the field of discourse analysis and conversation analysis and pragmatics and so on, building up, building up, building up. Oh yes, in the end, there was plenty to write about. And the thing that, if there's a theme in it, it's obviously for the general public. It's not for specialists. But what I find is that people don't realize just how much conversational subtlety lies underneath the, now I call it a bonnet, but you call it a hood, don't you?
Right.
Not quite
But
sure.
I can translate.
Yeah, oh, good, good. But there's so much there that people don't realize. I mean, I start the book with an example that many of our viewers now will know, but an awful lot of people don't know. I say to people, you know, what's the difference between good morning and good night as a greeting? And they say, well, I don't know, they sound different and so on. What sort of difference are you thinking of? And we explore it a little bit. And the point to be made is that when you say good morning to somebody, you say it only once to that person. You don't say it twice. If you do, the person looks at you oddly, and sometimes you apologize. I'm sorry, I've said good morning to you, haven't I? Good morning is once to one person. Good night, however, you can say as many times as you like to a person. You can say, oh, good night, Mark. Yeah, night, good night, night, Mark, good night. But I can't say to you, good morning, Mark, good morning, Mark, good morning. You know, there's a big difference here between coming to somebody and greeting and going away from somebody and saying farewell. And that's the kind of thing that people don't know about. I discovered when I would go into lectures and say, what's the difference? Can you tell the difference? And that's the kind of thing I mean. When you explore conversation, all sorts of unexpected little gems come up like that.
Okay, and the title of the book is How English Conversation Works. So, so I wonder, is it different? What are the differences with? Are there some universal things about conversation in other languages, or is there some things that make English very unique?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I mean, the point here is that an awful lot, when you flip through the research journals in this area, huge amount on English and not so much on other languages. So you rely on anecdote, don't you? You rely on your impression as you travel around the world and the kind of differences that you encounter as you meet people, and the kind of differences in politeness that are there, and the expectations that are different, and so on. I do talk a little bit about this in the book because I talk about cultural differences in relation to English. To take one example, you know, in some parts of the world, we're having a conversation, we meet, we say hello, and get through that little fragment, and then straight in to the topic of the conversation. That's certainly the way I would expect it to be here in Britain, for instance. But if you go to some parts of the world, and I'm remembering now Japan in particular, and we were about to have a conversation with a group of teachers, and I wanted the conversation to start. They did not. They wanted that introductory atmosphere setting, getting to know you element go on for much, much longer. And as I've been around the world, I find that people have different expectations in that respect. So I expect that is a reflection of the language that they speak. But when you look for studies of these differences in the original languages, I haven't come across that many, though I think slowly the research base is building up.
Yeah. So I think of conversation as something that just happens, maybe a little bit like grammar in general. What what do we learn, or can we learn to appreciate about conversation that that you've discovered from studying it that is sort of, we're not just going to say, well, yeah, we knew that. That's how we talk.
Yeah. Well, take some of the things that people notice when they're having a conversation, like interruptions. Two people are chatting to each other, or more than two, of course.
I try not to interrupt if I can possibly.
And you go to online and type in interruption, and people will say, oh, it's terrible, interruption, I hate interruptions, interruptions should be banned, and so on. Interruptions get a bad press. Well, now, I used as a database for the book a whole pile of recorded informal conversation that was made years and years ago, actually, for the Survey of English Usage in London. And I used that as my database, as it were. And I went through and I looked at all the interruptions that were made. And you know what? Almost all bar one or two, I'm talking about a couple of hundred here, all bar one or two were positive interruptions. People welcomed them. They were supportive interruptions. There was somebody would be saying something, the other person chips in and adds something to what the first person was saying and was reacted to in a very positive way. I hardly ever encountered an interruption which people said, no, sorry, don't interrupt me, as it were. Now, these were informal domestic chats. Of course, the more formal the conversation gets, the more likely the interruptions are going to be disallowed and become negative. But in everyday informal conversation between people who know each other, interruptions are tolerated enormously. That's the sort of thing I mean. People don't usually realize that interruptions can have a good press as well.
Yeah, interesting. So I didn't.
Let me interrupt you, you see.
Yeah, no, please. Interrupt anything, please.
To give you another example, laughter. People laugh. Why do you laugh? And people say, because somebody said something funny. That's why we laugh. All right, I go through my database and I list all the examples of people laughing. And only about once in dozens of cases did somebody actually crack a joke that made somebody laugh. In all the other cases, the reasons for the laughter were the sort of thing that you just did a few seconds ago. As I interrupted you, you gave a little laugh. Why? Because it showed that you know, we're mates, we're getting on well here. You are happy with that interruption. You don't mind. It's just to cover a sort of perhaps slight embarrassment. Who knows? But the point is that laughter is not because I said something funny. And when you look at all the instances of laughing, it's always to do with something expressing sympathy, expressing empathy, and a whole range of attitudes. Humor is at the bottom of the list. That's another surprising example.
Yeah, and I suppose a new example of that is the use of LOL, which you've written about text speak, and when I guess I remember when text speak was new and people were saying LOL for the first time, and it was usually to show laughter, and now I'm finding it's simply I'm not sure what, just sort of maybe a signal that I'm being light here, or but something where there's no real humor necessarily involved.
No, people have been starting to study some of these early abbreviations and finding some interesting things. LOL is a very good example. There was a study done a year or so back, and it turns out that you can't just use LOL any place you like. I can send you a message about something happening and say LOL at the end of it. But when you analyze the semantics of that message, what it's actually saying, then as long as it's pretty emotionally neutral, LOL works. But if it's emotionally meaningful and empathic, then LOL doesn't work. For example, darling, I really love you. LOL. No.
I
No.
can see that doesn't work.
Do LOL after a statement where you are putting all your emotion into it. So LOL has quite a lot of subtlety about it, I think.
Yeah, interesting. So you are in, sorry?
I said we had a follow-up to that interruption
Please.
discussion that felt very timely. Anna Browning had a question that I think was very relevant. Anna, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, my question was whether you noticed any gender differences in the nature of the interruptions.
Oh, very interesting. No, I didn't, as a matter of fact. And this again goes against the tradition, doesn't it? That men interrupt more than women do. I mean, that's, you know, something that's been handed down since some of these first conversations were being introduced, being analyzed. No, I didn't notice that. Remember, we're talking here, my database was people who knew each other. There were a couple of husband and wives, a couple of partners, a couple of men talking to each other, a couple of women talking to each other, and so on. The rate of interruption that I found was pretty similar across gender and across everything. Mind you, my database wasn't that large, of course. It was just you know, a few hours in aggregate. I suppose if one increased the size of it, you might actually find some gender differences emerging. But I didn't notice anything for the samples that I used anyway. And that surprised me.
That surprises me too. Yeah. Any other questions, or should we?
We do actually have some related to the greetings. David had a query about good morning. David, if you want to unmute. There you are.
Hi, David. Nice to be here. Yeah, my question was whether you knew when and how and why hello replaced good morning.
Well, hello is very recent in the history of the language, isn't it? I mean, good morrow, of course, goes way back to Shakespeare and so on. Good morn, of course, earlier than that. Good morning comes in a little later. And there's no mention of hello or anything like that for ages. Hello comes in the telephone era, doesn't it? With the hello girls, as they were called in the 19th century, the first telephone operators. And hello gradually emerges and becomes widely used as a result of that. The hello and goodbye work in exactly the same way as good morning and good night. So you see somebody and you say hello or hi or something like that. You don't normally say it twice or three times. You can do in certain circumstances. I can come into a party and say hello, 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 or something like that. But that's, you know, an exceptional kind of instance. Whereas goodbye, imagine somebody standing on a train station and welcoming somebody. You might say hello a couple of times, but not more than that. But when the train's leaving and you're waving farewell to your friend, bye, goodbye, bye, bye, bye. You can say it as many as you like. So it's a bit parallel to morning and good night, it seems to me.
So I've never been to Wales. I've been to the UK, been to England. I'm told I should go to Wales. I should tell you that my mother and father are both from Luton. So my first language is English, and I certainly lost that when I went to school, but I know what a bonnet is, and so there are some terms that I have retained from that upbringing. But is it Holyhead or Holyhead? The Holyhead?
Good question. It's Holyhead.
Yeah.
And in some of the early texts, it's actually spelt with two L's, reflecting the pronunciation. Mm-hmm. But it's Holyhead etymologically, because Holyhead is the place where St. Cubby, one of St. Patrick's disciples, arrived back in the 6th century, was it? Something like that, 6th or 7th century. Settled here, set up his cell, and became a missionary to the Celts of those days. And in Welsh, Holyhead is Caer Gybi. That is the castle or fort of Cybi, Caer Gybi. And so the Holyhead is a holy head, really. And the pronunciation confuses everybody. But heck, you can talk about difficult pronunciations of place names. For years, I would say Connecticut without anybody correcting me until I realized.
Sure. Well, and of course, we have so many Native American names here that have been changed into French and maybe changed when the English came, and they continue to evolve. So I'm curious about geography because Holyhead is at the far western tip of northern Wales, sort of and I realize zooming in on the map that it's an island off another island, off
yes,
the larger island. And,
exactly that. And you know, when people say, "Where's Holyhead?" Americans say, "Where's Holyhead?" I like to say, "Oh, it's on the west coast." And people say, "Really? It's near San Fran, is it?" No. Wales, we're talking about. West coast of Wales. You're quite right. It's here's something nobody knows except me and a few other people around locally. Holyhead is actually the geographical centre of the British Isles. Now, how do you work that out? Well, if you take the British Isles, that includes Ireland, you see, and you go from Galway in the west of Ireland to East Anglia, which is in just above London there, draw a line that way, and then you go to John O'Groats up in Scotland and Land's End down the other end and draw a line that way, they cross at Holyhead.
All right.
So this is where the vibrations are strongest, Mark.
So it's those vibrations, I assume, as a young man, a young boy, growing up there, you had Ireland nearby, you had England, and of course the Welsh language. Is that where your love of linguistics came from, having that exposure to the different languages?
Oh, no question about it. Yeah. I grew up in a monolingual English household. The dad was at the war. My mum was an English speaker only. Some of her relatives were Welsh speaking, but she was English. And she told me when I was about 3, I would ask questions about why it was that when I went out onto the street, I could understand that person, but I could not understand that person. What's going on here? You know? And I think many people who grew up in that kind of environment, who are monolingual, have that curiosity about language very early on. And she said to me, evidently, well, it's because that's English and that's Welsh. And I said, well, why can't I speak Welsh? And she said, well, you can't. And I said, I want to speak Welsh, like 3-year-olds say, you know. And she said, well, go and talk to Uncle Joe. So I went to talk to Uncle Joe, who was a Welsh speaker, and he was delighted, of course, because everybody's very concerned about the future of the Welsh language. And he started to teach me Welsh. So by the time I went to school, primary school, I had a smattering of Welsh as well as English. And then it built up in primary schools to the extent that if I'd stayed in Wales, I'd have become really fluent. But I left at the age of 10 and went to live in Liverpool, which is the accent mainly that you're hearing now, a northern accent, not a Welsh accent. I could put on a Welsh accent for you if you like, but I'm not going to do that, you see. But I am bidialectal now in Welsh and in, as it were, Northern English. So my Welsh is still there, and indeed that was one of the factors that led me to get interested in language. There were lots of others, collecting stamps, for instance.
Oh.
Anybody who's collected stamps as a little kid looks at these foreign stamps and the foreign language that is there and wonders why, you know. That's where I learned my first Hungarian and my first Japanese and my first French, just fragments on these stamps, all adds up. And then I was brought up a Catholic. I served Mass, so I learned Latin in those days. I learned all the responses in Mass in Latin. That was a strange thing. I was really quite a linguist by the time I was 8 or 9. to the extent that I remember inventing a language, you know, like many linguists did when they were little. Just a crazy language, you know, a nonsense language. And I wish I still had it, but I don't. So all of that is formative, I think, for anybody who eventually will start to study languages in a more systematic kind of way. And then when you get to university, of course, study them in a really detailed kind of way. But it started when I was 3, indeed.
Okay. Well, I wish you had that invented language. Did it have I'm sure it had words and terms. Did it have a grammar to it?
Oh, it was very Latin based, I have to say. You know, I was very struck by Latin and tried to analyze it a bit. So I put all kinds of endings on, you know. Kids do this quite a lot. There's a language play system called Pig Latin, for instance, where you just add a syllable on at the end of a, every a, word a, like a, I a, am a, doing a, now a. And kids play this kind of game indefinitely, and they have great fun with it.
We do have a question, I think, from Ellen. Is that right, Heather?
Yes, Ellen had a question. Ellen, do you want to unmute and ask?
I'm unmuted. I'm a huge David Crystal fan, first of all. So oh wait, you can't see the book. Look
can't see a thing.
The book is invisible. It's got special powers. All right. I'm very pleased to hear that as a chronic female interrupter, I have some reasons to be accepted. So thank you for that. I had a question about good afternoon, because I teach email etiquette, and I've noticed that it's very unpopular as a way to open emails. I'm obsessed with email greetings, and I think they are a reflection to a certain degree of our conversational habits. And one thing that I think about, the business day, the standard business day is 9 to 12. So 3 of the hours are in the morning for most people and 5 are in the afternoon, but you can hardly find an email that begins good afternoon. And I'm wondering if you could explain that.
Oh, gosh, no, I can't. I've noticed it as well. It's something to do, I think, with the uncertainty that you mentioned, the fact that nobody is quite sure when an afternoon starts. Is it from 12 o'clock or is it after lunch? In the same way, nobody's quite sure when an afternoon finishes. Is it when it gets dark? Is it at 6 o'clock? Is it when evening starts? Or when does evening start, you see? Morning and night are pretty clear cut, but afternoon and evening have these fuzzy boundaries. And I think because of that, people are less willing to use them simply because they're not entirely sure whether there would be rapport, you know, whether there'd be an accommodation with the person they're in touch with. That's the only reason I can think of.
I tend to do this. I will say good morning up until noon, and then if I realize, it's 20 after noon, I can't say good morning now. What do I say? I don't switch to good afternoon. I think because it seems it's a little bit more formal. It's less common, probably for the reason you mentioned. You know, good morning is very common. Good afternoon is something we don't say too often.
Yes.
I want to know from Ellen, what was the book? Because just hold it up in front of you, and then maybe or you could just tell us what the book was.
The Stories of
English.
English.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
There.
There you are. Well,
Stories
of English. That was one of my favorite books to write, I have to say. It was. It started, of course, because of the television series that was shown in the States as well, I think, and in Canada too, and probably all over the place, called The Story of English. Robert McCrum and others involved in it. I was one of the consultants on it and did the radio series relating to it. And the idea was there, you know, that there was one story of English, just the story of standard English, and that's the only one worth telling. Well, you know, when you go around the English-speaking world, there's only a tiny minority of people who actually speak standard English in any day of their lives. They write it, of course. That's what standard English is for. That's how it evolved as a written expression. But all the amazing accents and dialects and varieties that were non-standard weren't getting a look in. There was some reference in the television program, but not very much. So Stories of English was really a kind of corrective to that. And I'm you know, I really enjoyed exploring it because it took me down avenues I'd never been down before.
Interesting. I was looking, I don't know if anybody sees me, I'm on video camera, and I'm back here looking at my books because I like to pull books off the shelf, and I was looking for the stories of English, but it doesn't seem to be there for some reason. But I don't have very many David Crystal books on my shelf. These are all Word books, and I feel like I need to confess this to you. And the one book I have here is Invisible. Is a recent book, Making Sense, The Glamorous Story of English Grammar. And then I've got, in my dictionaries, I've got your Shakespeare's Words that I picked up in Stratford, Ontario.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we should talk about it.
Well done. Yeah.
I've read your, I got from the library your book that you wrote with your wife, on traveling Britain.
Oh, Wordsmiths and Warriors. Yeah.
Yes, right. English Language Tourist Guide to Britain. And
that's right.
Yeah, that was nice. That was a fun read. All your books have that quality of being very approachable, being very conversational, and this is why this is so much fun, because it's like we're your books.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad you feel that. It's something I work at hard. And one of the things which I do, which maybe a lot of other authors do as well, I always read the text aloud before sending it off, as it were. And that reading aloud process, making it conversational, making it sound, I mean, suddenly you realize that a sentence that you thought was really quite a good sentence is unspeakable because it should break in the middle, or something like that. Right. And so I rewrite it. Or the subject has too much weight in it, and you want to put the weight towards the end of the sentence to make it more conversational. So reading aloud is a strategy I've always, well, not always, but I learned to do it a long, long time ago, and I would always do it now.
Yeah, that's and that is something that if more authors did that, then we copy editors would have less to work with.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. One of the things I do, and in the days when I used to do a lot of editing, was I would always say to the person, just read that sentence back to me before we start arguing about it.
Yeah, very good. Let's talk about Shakespeare. This is another area that you've done quite a bit on it, and I was talking with Heather before we started about some of the videos that you've done yourself and with your son Ben, talking about the original pronunciation and the language, and those are very interesting.
Yeah, well,
that was really different books.
Yeah, that was another unexpected thing. You've said I write a lot of books. Answer, yes. Why? Why? Because people ask me to. Hardly any of the books I've written, certainly in the last couple of decades, have been my idea. No, they've come up in a conversation. Somebody said, David, is there a book on language on the internet? Answer, no. Well, would you write one then? Answer, well, I'll try. Language and the internet came out of that. A couple of years previously, somebody said, what about a book on endangered languages? Is there one on endangered languages? An introductory book? No. Would you write one then? And of course, once the idea is in your head, you can't get rid of it until you've explored it and seen whether it was possible to write that book, and out it comes. Now, exactly the same thing happened with Shakespeare. I was fortunate as an undergraduate in going to University College London, where the English course there was half language, half literature. So in the morning, you might be studying phonetics. In the afternoon, you might be studying Shakespeare. And indeed, there were two very great Shakespeare scholars there at the time. One of them, Hilda Hume, that many of your listeners, watchers, viewers might know. Winifred Nowotny was another. And I fell in love with Shakespeare at that particular point. Actually, I had already been to Stratford a few times in my teens, so I was getting enthusiastic about Shakespeare, but the degree experience really fostered it. And I stayed in touch with Shakespeare over the years, but indirectly, because when you do linguistics, my first jobs were in linguistics. And remember, linguistics is the science of language and languages in general. It's not English in particular. So I was spending most of my time on other languages in those days. But then eventually I specialized in English. And as soon as you do that, then up comes English literature once again. And if there's one principle that governs, I think, all my writing, is that I try to introduce a balance between language and literature into everything I do. I try to bring as many literary examples into my language work, and vice versa, if I ever have the occasion to do something literary. Now, Shakespeare arrives, of course, quite unexpectedly in the form of young Ben that you were mentioning. Because Ben, you see, wanted to be an actor. We told him that actors don't work, so he'd better go and do something serious. And he went and did a degree. In the end, he chose, without me forcing him, honest, he chose to do a degree in linguistics and English language at the University of Lancaster. Spent most of his time in the theatre, as far as I can tell, but nonetheless got his degree. And as a result, when he left, he was indeed able to start doing some collaborative work with me on projects when he wasn't working, when indeed he was resting, as the actors say. And that's how Shakespeare's words came about. Because one day he was on a train and he was checking on a part he had been given. He had to learn the part and he wanted to look a word up. And it wasn't in the traditional glossaries that had been around. C.T. Onions' glossary, for instance, which is 1911, you know, very old work. And he said to me, what's this word mean? And I said, well, I'm not entirely sure. I'll just look it up. And suddenly realized there's nowhere to look it up. I had to go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look it up there, you know, and tell him. And that's where the idea for Shakespeare's words came from. And the reason for the collaboration is quite simple. If you're a lexicographer, you are interested in studying the history and meanings of words, and of course the pronunciation and so on as well. And as far as I was concerned, a dictionary entry goes like this. Here's a word, here its pronunciation, here its history, here its meaning. End of story. Ben says to me, hang on, if we're talking about Shakespeare and we're wanting to do a book that's going to be of interest to actors and others, we need to know more than that. We need to know who said that utterance where the word turned up, and who did they say it to, and what was the context in which they said that word. And I suddenly realized, of course, you know, we've missed out on all the, as it were, the sociolinguistics and the pragmatics of language, and that rarely gets into a dictionary in a systematic kind of way. So whenever you see a definition, an illustration in that book, it'll always be, here's so-and-so saying it to so-and-so about something. And you think, well, you know, is that going to be really illuminating? Well, yes, because the other big thing about studying Shakespeare, or I suppose any work of literature really, is the generation gap. You know, I was brought up with Latin and Greek and all sorts of goodies. I did classics at school and things like this, and I know an awful lot about the classics. Ben, on the other hand, didn't get that kind of background. And the later generation, the teenagers now, get hardly any of that sort of thing. I've met teenagers at school who have no idea who Venus is or Zeus or anything like that. And so we suddenly thought, you know, the generation difference is going to help. And I can give you one example of how it came up. We were looking at the entry on Goths. Now, Goths turn up in Titus Andronicus as a race of people who attack Rome. And Ben said, you know, we need to have an entry on Goths. And I said, no, Ben, we don't. You know, everybody knows who the Goths are. You know, Goths and Vandals pillaging in the old days. We all know that. Yes, Dad, he says, you know, Goths are people with black eye makeup. And he then described the Gothic scene of the modern youth. And I suddenly realized, of course, to a younger person, they would assume that Goths meant that. So the entry on Goths went in. And there were hundreds of examples like that. And that's how Shakespeare's words came to be. The book itself is pretty thick, as you saw. It's the biggest book that Penguin actually did at the time. It's 700 pages. But even that is only a fragment of the Shakespearean canon. And so what people need to know, if they don't know it already, is that there is now a corresponding website. So in the website, shakespeareswords.com, you get all the instances of a word that turns up in Shakespeare. For instance, the word bootless, meaning it's unnecessary or something like that, or pointless. Well, you look at bootless in the book and it gives you 3 or 4 examples of where it's used. There are something like 20 or 22 instances of bootless in the entire canon. Type bootless into the search engine on Shakespeare's words and you get all 22 entries there, you see, so you can explore all the examples. The book is a great introduction, but these days I think it needs to be supplemented by the website.
Yeah, but much better, for instance, having the OED available online, the Oxford English Dictionary, than taking up shelves.
Absolutely. And you can put so much more into your website than you could in any book. I mean, I would love, for example, to have had a thesaurus element in Shakespeare's words. Out of the question. It's already 700 pages, you know, but online you can have a thesaurus, which we have. And that's the beauty of online. It brings lexicography into a completely new world, doesn't it?
So here, there have been several productions in London of in original pronunciation, as I understand. And is that, I think one thing with Shakespeare is a lot of the words are lost to us, but it's English, and so we figure we know the story, and so we figure we can make do, we can get along. But I find that there's a lot of words, a lot of terms that, well, we just don't get the jokes.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And we kind of skip over it. Does the original pronunciation need some further coaching for the audience to sort of appreciate what's going on?
Well, let's have an example, and then I'll explore it a little bit. You know, if we take the opening of Henry V, which in British English would go in received pronunciation, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene." Well, in OP, in original pronunciation, it would be, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene." Now, when you hear that accent, it's an interesting accent. First of all, it's perfectly intelligible, isn't it? Despite it being 400 years old, as it were, everybody understands it. It's just like a modern accent, only not quite like any modern accent. Though people who hear it tend to identify with it. They listen to the R after the vowel, muse of fire, or it could be a trilled R, fire, you know, but an R is pronounced in those days. And they say, "Oh, I know where that is. That's West Country Britain. That's pirates. This is Pirates of the Caribbean. Ooh-ah, you know." Or Americans, of course, identify it, unless you're in New England or somewhere, identify with it straight away. But there are other features of the accent that relate to other parts of the English-speaking world. A kingdom for a stage. Stage, not stage. 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 Where do people say that? Well, if you're in Britain, you know exactly where it's said. They say it up in Yorkshire. You know, good day, on the stage. Ah, you lad, you know, that's a local thing from up there. Oh, for a muse of fire, not oh, for a muse of fire. Oh, where'd you hear that? All over the English-speaking world. You hear it in Wales, you hear it all everywhere. You hear it in pop songs, you know. People like Elvis Presley would go, oh, not oh, or anything like that. So OP has this kind of amalgamated echoes of many, many accents. And when it arrived, it's another one of these stories. I wasn't expecting ever to do anything on original pronunciation in Shakespeare, but the telephone rings in 2004, and it's from Shakespeare's Globe in London, built to do original practices, bit like the Blackfriars in Stanton. And it was Tim Carroll, the director, who says, David, we're doing a play, Romeo and Juliet, this year in modern English. We'd like to do it in original pronunciation as well. Can you help? So, of course, yes, love to. This is one of these new occasions, isn't it? And I went down and worked with the actors and so on. First of all, had to get myself familiar with it because it wasn't in the front of my mind at the time, and was expecting that to be the only show, that it was just a bit of an experiment. But no, it was so successful. People felt that Shakespeare was coming off the stage towards them in a warmer way than in traditional Southern Queen's English received pronunciation. And in the audience were Americans, amongst others. And they went back to the States and felt that OP was a much more attractive accent in many ways than received pronunciation. I've spoken now over the last 20 years to many American actors and directors, and they all tell me the same story, that for years they had difficulty owning Shakespeare because they felt, first of all, they weren't British, so they couldn't get at some of the British terms. Secondly, they couldn't master the received pronunciation accent in which Shakespeare had to be done. Because, of course, they were thinking of Laurence Olivier and John Gielgud and all the great Shakespearean actors. So for many of them, they felt, we're never going to be able to own Shakespeare in the same way. And now along comes OP, original pronunciation, which actually sounds more like American English than Southern British English does. And so you guys picked it up. It was explored in small ways in New York and Washington, in DC in sort of 2007, 2008. The first big production was Paul Mayer's at Kansas University in 2010. He did the entire Midsummer Night's Dream in OP. And then that went on to Reno, where Eric Rasmussen did an OP production of Hamlet, in which Ben played the part of the Dane. And suddenly everybody was trying it out. In downtown Houston, they tried Julius Caesar. They did something in Blackfriars. The Baltimore Shakespeare Factory does an OP production every year now. So it's really taken off in the States more than any other country in the world.
Well, that's very interesting because I had no idea that it was going on here. I haven't seen that around. So now, of course, I'm going to look for the next production I can see of that.
Yeah, very, very few productions have actually been, filmed and audioed for commercial purposes, but Paul Mayer's has. So you can actually, if you go to his site, paulmayer.com, MEIER, and you'll see the download for the audio and the video of Midsummer Night's Dream.
Terrific. All right, so I've done what I didn't really want to do, and that's keep people waiting on their questions. I have many questions, but maybe we'll go ask the audience for what they'd like to know. And actually, I think Heather's probably looking up that website, Paul Mayer, so she can share that with the group.
And we have a couple of topics. We can talk about space fillers, online communication, preservation of languages. What is your fancy?
Oh, gosh, yes. That was your problem, Mark. Which would you like to hear about first? They're all good.
I think space fillers is a good topic.
Perfect. Kate, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Come on, here we go. Okay. I'm curious about how you would discuss a space filler. For example, you say to me, I do believe that this is correct. This is as close to an American English pronunciation for Shakespeare as you can get, and I wouldn't know what to say, so I'd say, instead of answering it with something intelligent. Do you cover that at all, or have you?
Yes, surely I do. In the conversation book, there's a section on the importance of filler words and phrases in conversation. I liken them to the oil that keeps the conversation going smoothly. Sometimes, of course, people put too much oil in and the conversation sort of drowns a bit. But on the whole, these filler words and phrases, now they include everything from basic hesitation noises like and to more complex phrases like you see, you know, I mean, mind you, to even more complex things like to be perfectly honest, as a matter of fact. And all these phrases which are sometimes there just to give yourself some thinking time as much as anything else. And of course, they get a bad press, don't they? Because politicians very often, naming no names, can use rather a lot of them. Mr. Minister, can you tell us a straight answer to that question? Well, yes, you see, because, you know, I mean, well, like it is really, you see, and you get this kind of string of fillers without anything serious being said. So they get a bad press, but without them, conversation would be pretty disastrous, actually. They keep the rhythm going. They mustn't be overused. That's the important thing. If they're overused, then people will notice them and they'll get criticized. But if used in a subtle kind of way, then they have all sorts of values. And there's a grammar to them as well, and an acceptability rating for them as well. You can't just use them randomly all over the place. Take you know as a case in point. When can you use you know? You can use it at the beginning of a sentence. You can say, you know, I've been thinking about that. You can use it at the end of a sentence. You can say, I've been thinking about that, you know. You can use it in the middle of a sentence. But if you use it in the middle, you've got to be careful where you put it. For instance, can you say this in English? I've just been down to New, you know, York. No, people don't break up proper names with a you know. They put you know in at certain points in the sentence, and not just randomly. And sometimes it can change the meaning. Take this one. John and his friend have just gone to New York versus John and his, you know, friend have just gone to New York. Well, the two sentences don't mean the same thing. Obviously now friend has some special kind of meaning. So all these phrases, and even something as simple as a hesitation noise, they've got some kind of communicative value. And one of the things about learning a foreign language fluently is learning to master these. They're one of the most difficult things for learners of English to master.
You've observed language changing over the years. And actually, this is somebody else's question. I should let somebody ask this, but yeah, we have a question about online communication and how that has changed the language. Has it changed more quickly? Has it, Heather, who's?
Yes, Carrie Smith wanted to ask
yes.
about online conversations.
Sorry if I asked part of it myself. Go ahead, Carrie.
Hello, hi. Can
Hi
you hear
there.
me? Hi.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the start of this talk that you'd been spending a lot of time on Zoom and various conversations recently. And I just wondered what you'd noticed about how that impacts upon language. Personally, you know, I'm aware that lots of people that I've talked to have said that they find this a far more quite exhausting way of communicating. And I just wondered what you'd noticed about how we use Zoom in order to communicate and how that affects language and communication.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's very tiring, isn't it? Because you're always on, you know, you're always there on that screen with whoever else in the room with you. And the technology isn't perfect, so there is always a little bit of a lag. It might be only very small, but it's enough. People don't quite know. Interruptions are not easy without conversation breaking down. The filler phrases we've just been talking about are typically absent. People don't normally say, you know, and you see, and I mean, and all that sort of thing when they're in a Zoom kind of environment, or for that matter, in any kind of online interaction. You know, you don't get these in emails either, or in instant messaging and things like that. So there's a certain artificiality about the whole situation. It's too soon to say anything systematic about Zoom because, you know, until a few months ago, hardly anybody knew about it. You know, and so the research side of things hasn't built up yet. I certainly haven't done any systematic work, but having been on Zoom a few times now, there is this uncertainty. The biggest difficulty is the lack of simultaneous feedback. Now, what do I mean by that? In a face-to-face conversation, two people talking to each other, one person is doing all the talking, the other person, however, is not staying quiet. The other person is going, uh-huh, yeah, uh-huh, yeah, I see, oh, yeah, really, yeah, and all of that. Now, without that, a conversation cannot take place. Any of you out there who would like to try this, choose your target carefully, and then while in the middle of the conversation, withhold those vocalizations and facial expressions. Just suddenly switch off. The conversation cannot continue. The person who's doing the talking will go, what, hello, you know, are you all right? Are you having a heart attack? Have I upset you in some way? You know, they cannot carry on. But so simultaneous feedback is what makes a conversation flow smoothly face to face. Now, online, that doesn't exist. Even in the most instant of Skype interactions, as it were, you don't get that kind of immediate simultaneous feedback. You can get successive feedback. In other words, after you've said something, somebody can react. But while I'm talking now, if you are making noises at me, and most of you aren't, you're just paying attention, you're not reacting in a simultaneous feedback sort of way. Even if you were, I wouldn't be able to see you. I can only see Mark at the moment. I don't know, you know, who else is there. And if there were 30 screens, in an event I was on the other day, there were 30 people on screen. I can't pay attention to all of them, or even one of them. So I pay attention to none of them. And as a result, feedback is missing. So that's the main reason why I think online interactions have that sort of artificiality, and why suddenly you realize when you're talking to people on Zoom, you're on your own. You're not getting that help from your listener, which you would expect in other situations.
That's a terrific question. Thank you for that, Carrie. I want to ask one more, which is what I was getting to, that Carrie had a much better question than I did. So it's good that we did hers first. That's very interesting because it's very timely for us right now. But you've had a long career as a linguist. You've watched language change as the mediums have changed. And now we have entered into this, some of the things you talked about, the instant communication, the emails, the texting, things like that. Is language changing faster? Are you observing more of structural changes, or are they more superficial changes? What do you?
No, not much at all, really, which surprises people. I mean, what the internet has done is offer us a wide range of new styles of language, new varieties of language, new opportunities, things we can do with language you could never do before, like cut and paste, you know, things like that, or pay attention to several participants at the same time, like in a chat room, and you see suddenly interventions coming down the screen and you can notice all of them, which you can't do if you go to a cocktail party or something and there are 10 conversations going on. You can't pay attention to all 10, whereas online you can. So there are opportunities like that. But when you look at the structure of language and you ask the question, how many new words have come into the English language, or any language, but let's stay with English, in the last 30 years, or at least since 1991 anyway, when the web started? How many new grammatical constructions? how many new punctuations and so on? And the answer is, well, not that many, actually. How many new words have come in? Well, I did this exercise for a book, 15 years ago now, so it's well out of date. And I spent a boring week trying to track down as many new internet words as I could, words like blog and blogger and things like that. And I ended up with a couple of thousand. And people say, that's a lot. No, it isn't. English has over 1 million words, probably many millions of words. Nobody's ever counted them. Nobody could count them. An extra couple of thousand words is nothing. And if the job were being done now, it might be 5,000 or even 10,000 words have come in because of the internet. That is not a fundamental change in English vocabulary. What about grammar? Any new grammatical constructions that have come in the internet because of the internet? I cannot think of one. I mean, all right, in instant messaging, there are short sentences, but we've had short sentences since Old English times. If you analyze any piece of online communication, written, I mean, then you say, where are constructions that would not have been used before 1990? You can't find any. The biggest area, of course, where there is some change is punctuation. This is the most interesting one, because what the internet has done is it has given us new styles of punctuation that were not there before. So you get punctuation minimalism, where you leave out punctuation marks all over the place, like in emails and so on. You get punctuation maximalism, where you send a message to somebody and have 15 exclamation marks in it, which has never happened in the history of English before. And then, of course, there are all the emoticons and the emojis and things like that, which is definitely a novelty. And then you get some interesting new usages of old punctuation marks. And the famous one, which made the front page of the New York Times a few years ago, was the new use of the period, the full stop. Now, normally in instant messaging and rapid exchanges, WhatsApp and things like that, if it's a statement, you don't put a full stop in at the end. So if I say to you, are you coming to the party? And you say, yes, I'm coming. And I say, that's fantastic. And you say, John's coming to the party as well. And none of those statements have full stops at the end. That's fine. It means John's coming to the party as well. No comment. But if you were to write, John's coming to the party as well, full stop. Well, now for younger people, that means, oh dear, John's coming to the party, is he? The full stop has taken on an emotional charge, and that is new in the history of English. So in punctuation, I would say there are some novelties, but in grammar and vocabulary, nothing much.
All right. Well, we are at an hour, and I told you earlier that we had some people come in earlier thinking the 4:30 was in England and not in Columbus, Ohio, where I am. And so as one last thing before we go, and thank you very much for taking this time with us. It was extremely interesting and a wonderful hour. But if you could, we have some students in Cheshire, A-level language students listening in, and they were here earlier, excited to see you. And of course, there's a time mix-up. So Emma, Abby, and Millie, do you have any advice for these young English students looking for knowledge and doing well on their tests?
Well, hi, people in Cheshire. You're just down the road from me. If only I could travel. I mean, it only takes me an hour to get to Cheshire, or just over an hour, but I'm not allowed to travel anymore, so that's out of the question. Lovely to hear from you. Yes, what's my general advice for people doing English language A-level, perhaps in their case, or other exams where English language is at the focus? My answer is very simple. Collect stuff. That's what I do. The Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language, which is a large book. Encyclopedia, how do you do that? You collect. I had a bottom drawer, I still have, full of stuff. Little observations from here and there. You may come across a strange place name, put it in the bottom drawer. or these days, of course, on your iPhone or somewhere. You don't put it in a drawer anymore, do you, Mark? I'm sort of out of showing my age there. You collect your stuff. And the point is, where you live, you guys in Cheshire or anywhere in the world where you live is unique to you. And there will be usages in your part of the world and in your generation, in your part of the world, that I don't know anything about, nor does anybody else. And so these are the things you can bring into your collection. And when you're writing essays for exams and things like that, do use some of those local examples, because examiners love this. What examiners hate more than anything else is to see the same example churned out over and over and over that has been picked up from some textbook that everybody's been asked to read. And if you can bring in some new examples from your own experience, they'll love you. And certainly that's what I would hope to do if I were having to do my exams all over again.
Well, thank you very much for that. And if you ever do publish another book, maybe come back and we can talk about the next thing you discover about the English language.
Oh, yes. Well, that's the one thing, Mark, isn't it? Whatever English was like today, it was different yesterday. It'll be different tomorrow. There's an indefinite number of books waiting to be written. Oh, yes. Of the making of books, there is no end, the Bible says.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your interest. It's been a lovely hour. Thank you so much.
Good. Good. And, whoops. I'd say we always have some technical difficulties. And there it is. There it is. And there we go.
Great music, Mark.
Oh, thank you. That was my son.
Yeah.
He's a composer, and so I.
Oh, it's lovely. It's perfect for this kind of program.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Have a very good night.
Well, pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you all, and stay safe. It's the main farewell these days, isn't it? Stay safe.
Mm-hmm.
Bye-bye.